What is your name, please?
Oh, Cliff Kindy. I work with Christian Peacemaker Teams in the war zones of the world. So.
And why are we here at Aerojet today?
Well, in Iraq we used to see the effects of depleted uranium munitions in the children's hospital where babies were born without limbs, with one eye, without a brain, with organs outside the body. And then we came home and discovered that among veterans' families or veterans themselves, the cancer rates or leukemia rates or birth defects were also happening here in the United States. And then we heard about plants where there were plumes of leukemia downwind from the plants, or polluted water wells or aquifers below the plants that had produced depleted uranium munitions. And then we heard of two of them are Superfund sites, the ones like Aerojet that used to make the DU munitions. And Aerojet has been kind of back here invisible for decades, and we assume similar kinds of things are happening because the practices we hear from former employees who used to work here, there were no safety practices that were common at those times, so we assume that there is contamination, serious contamination. We found contamination inside the plant from samples we've taken, and we assume it's worse than that because of the things we used to hear about waste put on the settling pond, and at one point it was covered with 10 feet of concrete. So we're encouraging Aerojet to re-envision a different kind of work that's better for human beings, better for the environment, better for the workers, and better for this community, because this is DU is something that once it's sold, it leaves the community. It doesn't build the community like a farm that feeds people, or a tool like a hoe that gets used in somebody's garden to grow food for the family, or just the money keeps cycling. This money leaves the community and it doesn't come back unless it comes back in the bodies of soldiers who were in Iraq or Afghanistan. So how do we envision a different kind of company, and how do we envision cleanup? And maybe it starts by hearing the stories. So today we're going to hear the stories from people who live close to the plant, from veterans maybe who have experienced DU in Iraq or Afghanistan. It'd be nice to have civilians from those countries also come and tell their stories, because I think it's an important piece of the puzzle that we need to understand as we re-envision a new world.
Great. So can you tell me a little bit about Aerojet itself, the history of this plant and what it's been doing? And
it started when two of the people who worked at Nuclear Fuel Services, or whatever it was before it was NFS, brought some materials here and started, I think, what was Tennessee Nuclear Specialties.
Do you remember when that started?
My sense is it was in the mid to late 70s, and then it began to get some of the big contracts for DU munitions that were used in the first Gulf War, in Bosnia and Serbia, and in Iraq and Afghanistan. And according to the former Pentagon expert on DU, those were used as well by Israel. We sold big bunker busters, DU bunker busters, to Israel that were used in Lebanon, and he says the same applicators, the A-10 Warthogs, were used in Libya and maybe Somalia as well. So I don't know about those last two, but the other things seem pretty clear at this point.
So where does the depleted uranium come from, and over what roads?
It comes over the highways of Tennessee, and it comes probably, it's possible it could come from Nuclear Fuel Service still, because it is a waste product in their fuel enrichment process at Nuclear Fuel Services, but it could also come from places like Paducah or Portsmouth, Ohio, Paducah, Kentucky, where there are huge fields of DU, waste DU from nuclear power plants stored, and that are leaking, casks that are eaten through by the acid that's part of the process, and they're now leaking into the air, the deadly gas. So that's probably where it comes from, likely where it comes from. There are other places it could come, like from Canada, but transportation probably means it comes from closer places. And then it comes in a uranium tetrafluoride or hexafluoride gas. and then it's brought here and goes through different processes until they refine it into a chunk of metal, and then from that they can cut it with lathes or whatever, and they shape, for instance, like if it's the 120 millimeter projectile used in the Abrams tank, they would probably use lathes to cut it down, and then it's a center, like the central part of that shell is this depleted uranium core. And then in Radford, Virginia, there's a propulsion component that will be part of that shell, and it's all assembled in Pinto, West Virginia at an Alliant Tech plant, where they put the casing together with the penetrator core and then that propulsion component from Radford, Virginia. And then it's ready for shipment to the battlefields of the world. But there are all other kinds of shells, like you could make a shell that's for a M16, or a huge thing for a Tomahawk missile, or 10,000-pound bunker buster bomb that probably was used in Tora Bora, Afghanistan, or was probably given by the United States to Israel to use in Lebanon for underground bunkers. So any size of weapon, or the smaller one that's used on the A-10 Warthogs that dropped most of the DU munitions, probably the 300 tons that were dropped in the first Gulf War. And that's still a regular applicator.
And ships, what size do they use for ships?
Probably the Tomahawk missiles would come from the ships at sea, and those would be, I don't know what weight those have, but they're big weapons.
So where is Nuclear Fuel Services, NFS?
Nuclear Fuel Services is in Irwin, Tennessee, but about a half an hour, I guess, from here.
And what do they do?
And they enrich uranium for fuel, for nuclear, for like the Navy submarines or the aircraft carriers. So it's enriched fuel.
So it's a military, it's a DOD?
It's under inspection by the National Regulatory Commission, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In contrast to here, this would be the Tennessee Environmental TDEC. Environmental, I don't know, sorry.
Commission or something.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And so where do you live?
I live in Indiana. Our delegation that's been here this past week comes from Colorado, Indiana, Virginia. So there are 7 of us here in the delegation, and we've had a press conference with Michael Ketterer, who does the testing of the samples we've taken near here. We had an open forum at East Tennessee State University on Tuesday with experts from various directions working on the DU issue. And then we've just visited with lots of people to try to learn more about it. For many of the people on the delegation, it's the first time they're dealing with the issue, so it's a learning process. We've met with physics professors, people from the Veterans Administration, from neighbors, people who used to work at Aerojet Ordnance, a journalist. How do you uncover the things that get covered up like Agent Orange did in Vietnam for 30 years? And at our forum, interestingly enough, there was a veteran who was in Vietnam who got his first compensation check for Agent Orange just this last week. So that's how long Agent Orange was covered up in Vietnam, and we're trusting that depleted uranium won't be covered up like that as it has been so far by the Department of Defense and the regulatory agencies and the production plants.
Do you know if there's any legislation currently in the U.S. Congress to ban depleted uranium weapons?
There was a bill that was attached to an appropriations bill, a rider that would have required the testing of all vets returning from Afghanistan and Iraq to test whether they've had DU poisoning. It seems that that's not been, although it was passed with the appropriations bill, it seems that that's not happening yet. There are ways to see changes happening. The U.S. Navy has stopped using DU munitions. There are organizations like the European Union that have, in some places, banned its use. The European Parliament has considered refusing to allow military personnel from the European Union to serve in areas where DU has been used. There are agencies of the United Nations that declare that this kind of tool used in war zones is a war crime because it's indiscriminate. It doesn't differentiate between civilians or military. It keeps on killing after the fact. It has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, so it hangs around for a while. And it impacts DU, especially attaches to the brain and to DNA. And that's the cause of birth defects that are happening so tragically in Iraq and Afghanistan and here among our own vets here in the States. But it keeps connecting to that code that goes from generation to generation. So any weapon that does that kind of stuff is potentially genocidal because it could destroy the human DNA code. But there are changes that give me hope, and the ways in which this community is being willing to speak out against nuclear fuel services, the ways in which we're hearing those voices from neighbors here at Aerojet or from veterans coming back, I think is, as somebody said the other night, a sea change in sort of the mood or the spirit here in eastern Tennessee.
Do you think that the education that you and others have been trying to do in these communities has had anything to do with that?
Oh, I trust so. Yes.
Yeah. How long have people been demonstrating outside the plant here in Aerojet and slowly
Well, if you
getting
go back
through?
in history, there was a strike here in I think it was 81, and for 4 years that strike was working its way through the National Labor Relations Board and went even to the Supreme Court. It was rejected by the Supreme Court, but I think it was clear they were on strike because of working conditions, safety conditions. It wasn't an issue of wages or anything like that. It was an issue of safety. And I mean, since then, Aerojet has improved its working conditions in the plant, but our concern is that they're still making the weapons that aren't safe in the world. Oh, it's a nice way to unload our nuclear waste that we don't know what to do with and spread it around the rest of the world, but that's not very nice to people who live there or for anybody else because that breathes the air that circles the globe each day. One thing that's interesting, when a DU shell hits a target, like a tank, and it's an excellent weapon because it can pierce the hardened armor on tanks, it can take out underground bunkers, because it's heavy, 1.7 times the density of lead, it carries about 2 miles further than a traditional shell, so it's a distinct advantage on the battlefield. But the problem is that it's not so nice to human beings, and there are human beings inside the tank, and once it hits that target, it aerosolizes, like 50 to 70% of the shell becomes tiny, tiny particles, so tiny that they're carried on the wind, and they can be taken into our lungs. So it's different from shrapnel that embeds in my skin, a piece of DU. Inside my lungs, the alpha particles from DU can wreak havoc on the immune system, our immune system. It can wreak havoc on our DNA. It can lodge next to an organ and then end up with cancer. Causes skin rashes, headaches, your eyes start to go bad, your ears start to go bad. It destroys your body, and that whole complex of things is at least part of what's happening with the Gulf War Center, with vets coming back. But the DOD, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon says, well, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Well, the tests are still inconclusive, even though a Pentagon researcher, Alexandra Miller, has documented that you'd expect a certain amount of reaction from the chemical toxicity of DU and a certain amount of reaction on the human body from the radioactive toxicity of DU. But she says in combination, it results in 6 to 8 times what you would expect from those individually. So it's tragic. for the human race.